There is a sentence that silently destroys more lives than failure ever could. Maybe prosperity just isn't meant for me. Sarah Mitchell never said those words out loud, but every decision she made whispered them. 42 years old, sitting alone in her car in the parking lot after another declined payment notification flashed across her phone, she stared through the windshield as the rain blurred the lights around her. It wasn't the empty checking account that terrified her anymore. It was the growing realization that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many books she read, no matter how many mornings she promised herself that life would finally change, something invisible always pulled her back to the same place. Just moments earlier, someone had asked her a question so simple that it stopped every thought in her mind. What if you've never actually been afraid of having too little money? She wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to laugh. But then an old memory surfaced without permission, carrying a feeling she hadn't touched in decades. Her heartbeat slowed. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about bills, debt, promotions, or success. She was thinking about a promise she didn't even remember making. A promise that may have quietly shaped every financial decision, every missed opportunity, every relationship with abundance she had ever known. If that promise was real, then everything she believed about prosperity had been upside down from the very beginning. And if it could be undone, then perhaps the life she thought belonged only to other people had never been out of reach at all. Before Sarah discovered the 4 simple Hooponopono phrases that millions repeat without truly understanding, she had to confront a truth so uncomfortable that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. And that truth may be the exact reason why 99% of people never experience lasting prosperity. Sarah sat in complete silence long after the rain had stopped. The windshield was finally clear, yet somehow everything in front of her still felt blurred. She reached for her wallet, opened it, and slowly counted the few bills inside, not because she needed to know the amount, but because she had performed this same ritual hundreds of times before. Every number seemed to carry a feeling much heavier than its value. It was never just $20 or $50. It was relief, fear, guilt, hope, and disappointment folded together inside pieces of paper. She closed the wallet, leaned back, and whispered to herself, "How did I end up here again?" That question had followed her for nearly 2 decades. Every time life appeared ready to move forward, something unexpected happened. A promotion slipped away. An investment opportunity appeared at the wrong moment. An emergency expense erased months of careful saving. A promising business idea lost momentum before it ever found success. None of those events looked connected on the surface, yet together they formed a pattern that Sarah could no longer ignore. She had worked harder than most people she knew. She had sacrificed weekends, vacations, evenings, and countless hours of sleep. She had listened to financial experts, attended workshops, read books about success, practiced positive thinking, and repeated affirmations every morning while making coffee. Still, deep inside, there was always a quiet voice asking the same painful question. What if none of this is enough? That voice rarely shouted. It did not need to. It simply waited until something went wrong and then reminded her that perhaps abundance belonged to other people. Perhaps she simply was not one of them. The strange part was that Sarah would never have described herself as someone who hated money. She wanted financial freedom. She wanted security. She dreamed of paying every bill without anxiety, helping her family whenever they needed support, traveling without calculating every expense, and waking up without immediately thinking about money. She admired successful people and celebrated their achievements. Yet every time prosperity seemed close enough to touch, she felt an invisible resistance that she could not explain. Looking back, she realized there had always been small moments that never made sense. She often underpriced her work even when clients praised the quality. She hesitated before accepting opportunities that required larger responsibility. She delayed sending invoices. She felt uncomfortable when someone complimented her success. Whenever her savings account finally began to grow, she found reasons to spend money on things that suddenly felt urgent. None of these decisions seemed dramatic on their own, but together they quietly shaped the direction of her entire life. Most people around her believed the explanation was simple. They said the economy was difficult. They blamed inflation, bad luck, unfair employers, expensive housing, rising insurance costs, or unpredictable markets. Sarah accepted those explanations because they sounded reasonable. Yet something inside her refused to believe that millions of different stories could all lead to exactly the same feeling of never having enough. If the external world were the only cause, then why did some people create lasting prosperity while others remained trapped no matter how hard they tried? As she sat alone in the fading evening light, the question from earlier echoed once again inside her mind. What if you have never actually been afraid of having too little money? She repeated the sentence several times. At first it sounded absurd. Of course, she feared not having enough money. Everyone did. But the more she allowed the words to settle, the more another feeling quietly emerged beneath them. It was not agreement. It was recognition. Something hidden had just been touched, something older than her career, older than adulthood, perhaps even older than her first paycheck. She could not explain why, but for the first time in years, she stopped asking how to make more money. Instead, she found herself asking a completely different question. What part of me has been quietly pushing prosperity away all along? That single question would lead Sarah toward a discovery she never expected, one that had almost nothing to do with numbers, income, investments, or business strategies, and everything to do with a forgotten story that had been living inside her long before she ever learned what money was. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because Sarah could no longer escape the question that had quietly taken root in her mind. She turned off the radio after only a few seconds because every advertisement about success, every commercial promising a better future, every cheerful voice talking about financial freedom suddenly sounded strangely distant. By the time she walked through the front door of her small suburban home, the silence felt more honest than any advice she had heard in years. She placed her keys on the kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the same wooden table where she had paid bills almost every month for the last 15 years. Nothing about the room had changed, yet something inside her had. She looked around and noticed objects she had stopped seeing long ago. The coffee mug with a tiny crack near the handle that she refused to replace because buying a new one felt unnecessary. The aging laptop that still worked well enough even though she had wanted a newer one for years. The notebook filled with carefully calculated budgets, goals, and plans, each one created with genuine hope and quietly abandoned after life interrupted them. It suddenly occurred to her that she had spent years trying to organize money while never questioning the emotions that appeared whenever money entered the conversation. Most people believe prosperity begins with numbers. They calculate income, expenses, investments, interest rates, retirement accounts, and savings goals. Those things matter, but Sarah realized they all come after something much deeper. Every financial decision is first filtered through the nervous system. Before logic speaks, emotion has already voted. Before planning begins, the body has already decided whether receiving more is safe or dangerous. Sarah had never thought of herself as someone living in fear. She was responsible, dependable, and disciplined. She rarely took reckless risks. Friends described her as calm under pressure. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a constant state of invisible tension. Whenever an unexpected opportunity appeared, her shoulders tightened before she even realized it. Whenever a larger client contacted her, her breathing became shallow. Whenever someone mentioned earning significantly more money, she felt admiration mixed with an emotion she could not name. It was not jealousy. It was discomfort. That realization unsettled her because discomfort rarely comes without a reason. The human body does not resist safety. It resists what it has learned to associate with danger. Sarah remembered reading years ago that the brain cannot always distinguish between physical threats and emotional ones. A painful childhood experience can become a lifelong alarm system, activating even when no real danger exists. What if prosperity itself had become linked to an old emotional warning? What if abundance did not feel peaceful to her unconscious mind? As these thoughts unfolded, memories began surfacing in fragments rather than complete stories. She could almost hear raised voices somewhere far back in time. She remembered standing in a hallway, too young to understand the words being spoken, but old enough to recognize fear inside the adults she loved. She remembered hearing conversations stop the moment she entered a room. She remembered watching facial expressions change whenever bills arrived in the mailbox. None of those memories felt dramatic on their own, Yet together they carried a familiar emotional atmosphere that had quietly followed her into adulthood. She had always believed that she was making rational choices about money, but perhaps those choices were simply echoes of feelings she had never questioned. If a child repeatedly experiences money as stress, conflict, disappointment, or loss, then money itself can become emotionally associated with uncertainty. Years later, even when circumstances improve, the body may continue responding as though abundance carries hidden consequences. This was not about intelligence. It was not about discipline. It was not even about financial education. It was about emotional conditioning so subtle that most people mistake it for personality. Sarah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. For the first time, she stopped trying to solve her financial life like a mathematical equation. Instead, she became curious about the emotional blueprint underneath it. Perhaps every repeated struggle had been pointing towards something much older than any paycheck. Perhaps the invisible barrier she had blamed on the outside world had been quietly living inside her all along, patiently waiting until she was finally ready to see it. As midnight settled over the neighborhood, Sarah remained at the kitchen table, her notebook still open but untouched. For years she had believed that every answer could be found by improving another budget, setting another goal, or discovering another financial strategy. Yet that evening she felt an unfamiliar resistance to writing a single number. It was as if her mind had quietly admitted that numbers were never the place where the real story began. She walked toward the living room and paused beside an old family bookshelf. Most of the books belonged to her mother now, carefully preserved through several moves, carrying the scent of paper and time. Without thinking, Sarah pulled out a faded photo album. She had not opened it in years. She slowly turned the thick pages until she found pictures from her childhood. Birthday parties, school concerts, summer afternoons in the backyard. At first everything looked ordinary. Smiling faces, holiday decorations, familiar places. But as she continued looking, she noticed something she had never seen before. In almost every photograph, the smiles disappeared during certain periods. The expressions became tense. The celebrations became smaller. Vacations quietly vanished. She could not remember exactly why, yet her body seemed to remember before her mind did. It was not the images themselves that affected her. It was the atmosphere surrounding them. Even as a little girl, she had learned to observe what adults never explained. Children rarely understand financial statements, but they become experts at reading emotional weather. They notice the silence after the mailbox is opened. They notice conversations that suddenly stop when they enter the room. They notice exhausted faces pretending everything is fine. Most importantly, they begin drawing conclusions that no adult ever intended to teach. A child does not think, "My parents are under economic pressure because of circumstances beyond their control." A child thinks, "Money makes people worried. Money changes people. Money is connected to fear." Those conclusions settle quietly beneath conscious awareness and remain there for years, shaping choices without asking permission. Sarah realized that she had spent her adult life trying to solve a problem that began before she possessed the words to describe it. She remembered one afternoon when she was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. She had walked into the kitchen carrying a flyer for a school field trip. The cost was not enormous, but she remembered the way her mother's smile faded for just a second before returning. Her mother gently said they would think about it, kissed her forehead, and changed the subject. Sarah never complained. She never asked again. In fact, she quietly decided that wanting things could create pressure for the people she loved. She had forgotten that moment completely, yet the feeling remained alive somewhere inside her. It was astonishing how a single emotional experience could continue influencing an entire lifetime without ever announcing its presence. Looking back, Sarah recognized a pattern that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Whenever she desired something deeply, another voice appeared almost immediately. It reminded her not to ask for too much, not to become a burden, not to create disappointment, not to expect life to be generous. Those thoughts had always sounded reasonable because they had been with her for so long. She assumed they were simply part of her personality. Now she wondered whether they were actually borrowed beliefs that had never belonged to her in the first place. The realization did not make her angry toward her family. Quite the opposite. She understood that every generation passes along more than traditions, recipes, and photographs. They also pass along emotional survival strategies. Her parents had done the best they could with what they knew. They had carried worries inherited from people before them, just as Sarah had unknowingly carried them forward. No one intended to teach fear. Fear simply traveled silently through everyday moments until someone became aware enough to stop repeating it. That thought lingered as she closed the photo album and rested her hand on its worn cover. If these invisible emotional patterns could be learned without conscious awareness, perhaps they could also be gently released through conscious awareness. She did not yet know how such a process worked, and she certainly did not expect an instant transformation. But for the first time, hope no longer depended on earning more, working harder, or becoming someone different. Hope began with the possibility that the oldest stories inside her might not have to become the rest of her future. The next morning, Sarah woke before sunrise, not because an alarm had sounded, but because her mind refused to return to sleep. For years, she had greeted each morning with the familiar checklist of responsibilities waiting for her attention. Today felt different. Instead of reaching for her phone to check emails or review her bank balance, she remained still, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. The house was silent, yet beneath that silence, she sensed something beginning to move inside her. It was not confidence. It was curiosity, and curiosity had replaced fear for the first time in a very long while. She walked into the kitchen, prepared a simple cup of coffee, and stood beside the window watching the first lights spread across the neighborhood. Children would soon leave for school. Neighbors would back their cars out of driveways and begin another ordinary workday. From the outside, life continued exactly as it always had. But Sarah could no longer pretend that her greatest obstacle existed somewhere outside those windows. She finally understood that the most powerful patterns in life rarely announce themselves. They become so familiar that they disappear into the background of everyday existence. They quietly influence what feels possible, what feels dangerous, and even what feels deserved. She remembered countless moments throughout her adult life when unexpected opportunities had appeared. A manager once encouraged her to apply for a leadership position. Her first thought had not been excitement. It had been doubt. A close friend had suggested starting a small consulting business together. Instead of imagining success, Sarah immediately pictured everything that could go wrong. Even when compliments arrived, she often minimized them before accepting them. Looking back, she realized that none of those reactions had been carefully considered decisions. They had happened automatically, almost faster than conscious thought itself. It was as though an invisible filter examined every possibility before she ever did, allowing only what felt emotionally familiar to pass through. That realization led her toward another unsettling question. If the mind protects what feels familiar more than what is actually beneficial, then perhaps many people unconsciously reject the very future they consciously desire. The body does not always choose growth. It often chooses familiarity. Even when familiarity includes limitation, uncertainty, or lack, it can still feel safer than stepping into something emotionally unknown. Sarah suddenly remembered a conversation she had once overheard between two successful business owners during a conference years earlier. One of them had quietly said, "Most people do not have a money problem. They have a receiving problem." At the time, Sarah had dismissed the statement as motivational language. Now it returned with completely different meaning. Receiving was not merely accepting a paycheck or depositing money into a bank account. Receiving required feeling emotionally safe enough to allow good things to remain. If prosperity created guilt, fear, pressure, or the expectation of future loss, then even abundance could feel threatening beneath the surface. That possibility explained experiences she had never understood. Every time life seemed ready to improve, an invisible discomfort appeared. She had mistaken that discomfort for caution, humility, or realism. Perhaps it had actually been an old emotional alarm system trying to pull her back toward what felt familiar. As these thoughts unfolded, Sarah opened the notebook that had remained untouched the previous evening. This time she did not write numbers. She wrote a single sentence across the top of a blank page. What did I learn about money before I was old enough to question it? She stared at the words for several moments. No immediate answer appeared. Instead, scattered memories began drifting into awareness like distant pieces of a puzzle. Her father's exhausted expression after working late shifts. The careful way her mother compared grocery prices. Quiet conversations behind closed doors that always seemed to happen near the end of the month. None of those moments had been intended as lessons, yet together they had become an education far more powerful than any classroom could provide. Without realizing it, Sarah had absorbed emotional conclusions that continued guiding her decades later. If money brought stress, then perhaps having more money brought more stress. If success demanded endless sacrifice, then perhaps staying small felt safer. If asking for more created pressure, then perhaps expecting less protected everyone. She looked back at the question in her notebook and slowly realized that the answers she had been searching for were not hidden inside financial strategies. They were hidden inside memories that had quietly shaped her identity long before she ever earned her first dollar. Somewhere within those forgotten moments lay the beginning of a story she had mistaken for reality, and until she understood where that story truly began, every attempt to create lasting prosperity would continue building on a foundation she had never consciously chosen. For the next several days, Sarah carried that notebook with her everywhere she went. She did not fill it with budgets or investment ideas. Instead, she began collecting memories. Some were clear. Others arrived only as emotions without complete stories. She quickly noticed something surprising. Every meaningful memory involving money also involved another emotion standing beside it. Fear, embarrassment, guilt, worry, responsibility, relief, rarely joy, rarely peace, rarely freedom. It was as though money had never existed alone in her life. It had always arrived holding the hand of another feeling. One quiet Saturday afternoon, she drove to the small neighborhood where she had grown up. The streets looked smaller than she remembered. Trees that once seemed enormous now cast ordinary shadows across familiar sidewalks. The old grocery store where her mother carefully compared prices had become a pharmacy. The elementary school playground had new equipment painted in bright colors. Time had changed the neighborhood, yet the moment Sarah parked across from her childhood home, something inside her remained exactly the same. She sat in the car for several minutes without moving. The house looked peaceful. Fresh paint covered the siding. Flower boxes decorated the windows. Anyone driving past would see nothing unusual. Yet Sarah knew that memories are rarely attached to buildings. They are attached to feelings. As she looked at the front door, a forgotten afternoon slowly returned with astonishing clarity. She was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table coloring a picture while her parents spoke softly in the next room. They believed she could not hear them. She could not understand every word, but she understood enough. Bills. Overtime. Mortgage. Another month. We will figure it out. She remembered the silence that followed those conversations. It always felt heavier than the words themselves. That evening, her father eventually walked into the kitchen, smiled warmly, and asked about her drawing. She smiled back, pretending everything felt normal. Children often become experts at pretending because love teaches them to protect the people they depend on. At that moment, without anyone asking her to do so, little Sarah made a quiet decision that no adult ever noticed. She decided she would never ask for anything unnecessary again. She would be easy. She would not create extra pressure. She would not become another problem for the family to solve. The decision lasted only a few seconds, yet its influence quietly stretched across decades. Sitting in her car as an adult, Sarah felt tears gather in her eyes, not because the memory was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. No one had intentionally taught her to fear prosperity. No one had told her she did not deserve abundance. The lesson had been created by love mixed with fear. A little girl believed that wanting less would help the people she loved suffer less. What began as an innocent act of compassion slowly became an invisible rule for adulthood. Do not want too much. Do not ask for too much. Do not become too much. The realization settled over her with unexpected gentleness. She was not broken. She was not lazy. She was not cursed by bad luck. She had simply remained loyal to a promise she no longer remembered making. That loyalty had quietly shaped every opportunity that required her to receive more than felt emotionally comfortable. Suddenly, many moments throughout her adult life became understandable. Every time success demanded that she step beyond those invisible boundaries, another part of her quietly pulled backward. Not because she lacked ability, but because somewhere deep inside, receiving more still felt connected to creating pressure for someone else. She closed her eyes and placed both hands on the steering wheel exactly as she had done only a few nights earlier in the parking lot after the declined payment notification. The difference was that now she was no longer asking why prosperity seemed distant. She was beginning to understand why a younger version of herself had unconsciously believed distance was the safest place for it. That understanding did not instantly erase years of emotional conditioning, but it changed something essential. For the first time, Sarah stopped blaming herself for repeating the same financial patterns. Instead, she became deeply curious about whether those old promises could finally be released. If they had been created quietly in the heart of a frightened little girl, perhaps they did not need to remain the invisible rules guiding the life of a grown woman any longer. I wish I could tell you that Sarah found the answer the very next day, that one realization instantly dissolved years of fear, and that every financial struggle disappeared overnight. Real transformation almost never happens that way. It begins much more quietly. It begins the moment someone becomes willing to see what has always been hidden in plain sight. During the following weeks, Sarah continued living her ordinary routine. She went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, prepared dinner, paid bills, and smiled politely during conversations that no longer felt quite the same. Externally, almost nothing had changed. Internally, however, every familiar situation had become an opportunity to observe herself. She noticed how her body reacted before her mind did. When an unexpected expense appeared, she immediately felt tension in her chest. When a client complimented her work, she instinctively minimized the praise before accepting it. When she imagined earning twice her current income, her first emotional response was not excitement, but uncertainty. These reactions fascinated her because they happened too quickly to be deliberate. They were automatic, almost as if someone else inside her had already decided what was safe long before she became aware of the decision. One evening, she stopped by a small independent bookstore after work. She wandered through the personal growth section without searching for anything specific. A thin blue book resting on a lower shelf caught her attention for reasons she could not explain. The title mentioned Hooponopono. She had heard the words several times over the years, usually connected to stories about healing, forgiveness, and inner peace, but she had never explored it seriously. She picked up the book, expecting complicated spiritual theories or abstract philosophy. Instead, she found something surprisingly simple. The central idea suggested that our external experiences are often connected to memories, emotional patterns, and unconscious programs operating within us. Rather than fighting the outside world, the practice invited people to take responsibility for cleaning the inner memories through compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, and love. Sarah paused after reading only a few pages. The language was gentle rather than forceful. It did not ask her to blame herself for every difficulty. It invited her to recognize that healing could begin inside, regardless of how old the emotional pattern might be. One sentence lingered in her thoughts long after she closed the book. It suggested that what repeatedly appears in life may be asking not for resistance, but for healing. As she drove home that evening, she reflected on those words. What if every repeated financial struggle had not been punishment? What if it had been an invitation to notice an emotional wound that had patiently waited for acknowledgement? The idea felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. For years, she had treated prosperity like a destination somewhere outside herself. Work harder, learn more, earn more, save more. Yet none of those goals addressed the frightened little girl who had quietly promised never to ask for too much. If that promise remained alive beneath the surface, no amount of external achievement could completely silence it. Once home, Sarah sat at her kitchen table again, the same place where so many anxious evenings had passed. She placed the small blue book beside her notebook and opened both at once. On one page, she had written memories from childhood. On the other were a few simple ideas about releasing emotional burdens rather than carrying them forever. For the first time, those two worlds began to connect. She realized that healing was not about pretending painful memories never happened. It was not about denying financial responsibility or waiting for miracles. It was about recognizing that every old emotional conclusion continued influencing present choices until someone consciously interrupted the pattern. Sarah closed her eyes for a few quiet moments. She did not know exactly where this path would lead, and she did not expect instant answers. Yet something important had already shifted. She was no longer searching for another strategy to force prosperity into her life. She was beginning to understand that prosperity might arrive naturally once the invisible barriers keeping it outside were gently released. Somewhere beneath years of fear, guilt, and inherited beliefs, there was likely a version of herself that had never stopped believing life could be generous. For the first time in many years, she felt ready to meet that version. I began to understand something that had never occurred to Sarah before. Healing was not about becoming someone new. It was about removing everything that convinced her she had to remain someone she had outgrown. That realization stayed with her during the following days as she slowly continued reading about Hooponopono. What surprised her most was not the simplicity of the practice, but the responsibility it quietly invited. Instead of asking who was at fault for the pain she carried, it gently asked a different question. What within me is ready to be released? At first, Sarah resisted that idea. She had spent years believing that responsibility meant blame. If something painful happened, someone must have caused it. If a financial struggle continued, someone or something outside herself must be preventing change. But this was different. Taking responsibility did not mean accepting guilt for everything that had happened. It meant recognizing that she had the ability to transform how old memories continued living inside her. One evening, she returned to the same chair by the kitchen window with the small blue book resting beside her notebook. The first Hooponopono phrase she encountered was surprisingly simple. I am sorry. She stared at those words for several minutes. Her first reaction was confusion. Why would she apologize to herself? She had already spent years criticizing herself for financial mistakes, missed opportunities, and decisions she wished she could change. The last thing she needed was another reason to feel guilty. Then she continued reading. The phrase was not an admission of failure. It was an acknowledgement that pain existed. It was a gentle recognition that somewhere inside, an old wound had remained unseen for far too long. Sarah closed the book and allowed herself to sit quietly. She imagined the little girl from her memories sitting across the table, the child who had silently decided never to ask for too much because she wanted to protect the people she loved. For years, Sarah had judged that frightened child for becoming an anxious adult. Now, for the first time, she saw something completely different. She saw innocence. She saw a child trying to create safety with the limited understanding available to her. Without realizing it, Sarah softly whispered, I am sorry. Not because the child had done something wrong, but because no one had ever explained that carrying the weight of the family was never her responsibility. The words felt awkward at first, almost unfamiliar. Yet something inside her seemed to relax. She realized that most people spend years trying to silence uncomfortable emotions without first acknowledging that those emotions have been trying to communicate something important. Fear rarely disappears after being ignored. It often softens only after being understood. During the following weeks, Sarah began noticing moments when old emotional reactions appeared. Instead of immediately pushing them away, she quietly paused. When anxiety surfaced while paying bills, she no longer argued with it. She simply noticed it. When worry appeared after checking her savings account, she observed it with curiosity instead of frustration. Each time she remembered the simple phrase, I am sorry, she directed it toward the frightened part of herself that still believed life could become unsafe at any moment. Gradually, she realized that the phrase was changing something subtle but profound. Instead of fighting her emotions, she was beginning to build a relationship with them. Instead of treating fear like an enemy, she was recognizing it as an old protector that had continued working long after its job had ended. That shift changed the atmosphere inside her. The constant inner battle slowly became a quiet conversation. One morning, while preparing breakfast before work, Sarah caught herself smiling for no obvious reason. Nothing dramatic had happened. Her income had not changed. Her bills had not disappeared. No unexpected check had arrived in the mail. Yet the pressure she had carried for years felt slightly lighter. She realized that hope no longer depended on immediate external results. Hope had begun the moment she stopped treating herself as the problem and started recognizing that old emotional memories could be met with compassion instead of criticism. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time she sensed that genuine prosperity might begin not with earning more, but with healing the part of herself that had quietly believed she had to remain small in order to keep everyone else safe. Over the next several weeks, Sarah continued practicing the first phrase whenever old emotions surfaced, but she gradually realized that acknowledging pain was only the beginning. One quiet Sunday afternoon, she returned to the small blue book and found the second phrase waiting for her. Please forgive me. Once again she paused. Those words felt even more uncomfortable than the first. She had always associated forgiveness with someone who had caused harm. Yet the explanation she was reading pointed somewhere entirely different. Forgiveness was not about pretending that painful experiences had never happened. It was about releasing the invisible bond that kept those experiences alive inside the present moment. Sarah slowly closed the book and stared out the window. Autumn had begun arriving, and a gentle breeze carried golden leaves across the backyard. Nature never argued with the changing seasons. It released what no longer belonged so that something new could eventually grow. She wondered whether the human heart had been designed to do the same thing. For years, she had unknowingly carried emotional conclusions that no longer matched the woman she had become. The frightened child inside her had believed that asking for more would create suffering for the people she loved. That belief had once served as emotional protection. Now it had quietly become emotional confinement. Sarah whispered the words, "Please forgive me," almost hesitantly. She was not asking forgiveness because she had been imperfect. She was asking forgiveness for continuing to believe a story that had kept both her younger self and her adult self trapped inside the same invisible boundaries. As she repeated the phrase over the following days, unexpected memories continued appearing. She remembered declining opportunities because they seemed too ambitious. She remembered apologizing whenever someone complimented her accomplishments, as though success required an explanation. She remembered feeling strangely uncomfortable whenever someone spent money generously on her. A friend once surprised her with an expensive birthday gift, and instead of simply receiving it with gratitude, Sarah had immediately searched for a way to repay the kindness. She had believed she was being polite. Now she wondered if she had simply never learned how to receive without guilt. That insight quietly transformed the way she viewed prosperity. Receiving was not limited to money. It included compliments, opportunities, kindness, support, encouragement, joy, and love. Every time she resisted receiving something positive, she reinforced the old belief that having more created emotional debt. She began observing people around her with fresh awareness. Some accepted help naturally and expressed genuine gratitude without embarrassment. Others immediately minimized compliments or insisted they did not deserve recognition. Sarah recognized herself in the second group. She finally understood that the inability to receive peacefully could quietly influence every area of life. The practice of forgiveness slowly softened something she had carried for years without noticing. She stopped judging herself for having inherited fearful beliefs. She stopped blaming her parents for passing along worries they had inherited from earlier generations. Instead, she saw an unbroken chain of people doing their best with the emotional tools available to them. Compassion replaced criticism. Curiosity replaced shame. She realized that forgiveness was not an event. It was a gentle process of loosening the emotional grip that old memories held over present choices. One evening after work, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from a former client asking whether she would consider leading a larger project than she had ever accepted before. The old reaction appeared immediately. Her heartbeat accelerated. Doubt whispered that someone else would be more qualified. The familiar urge to decline politely rose inside her. Then she paused. She recognized the feeling before acting on it. She quietly repeated the two phrases she had practiced so often. "I am sorry. Please forgive me." For a few moments, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden flash of confidence or overwhelming certainty. But something subtle changed. Instead of automatically obeying the old emotional program, she created enough space to make a conscious choice. She asked the client for a day to think about the opportunity rather than immediately saying no. It seemed like a small decision, almost insignificant, yet Sarah sensed that something much larger had quietly shifted. The invisible pattern that had guided countless choices throughout her life no longer held absolute authority. It could still speak, but it no longer had to make every decision. And in that quiet moment, she began to glimpse a future that had once seemed impossible, not because the outside world had changed overnight, but because the person responding to that world was slowly becoming free. After accepting the meeting with the former client, Sarah expected to feel either excitement or fear. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in years. She felt present. Her mind was no longer racing weeks into the future, imagining every possible mistake before a single step had been taken. She noticed that the old emotional storm still appeared from time to time, but it no longer swept her away without warning. There was now a quiet space between the feeling and her response, and inside that space, she discovered something powerful. She had a choice. The following evening, she returned to the blue book and found the third Hooponopono phrase. "Thank you." She smiled faintly because gratitude had always seemed easier than apology or forgiveness. She had written gratitude journals before. She had listed blessings, repeated affirmations, and tried to focus on positive thinking. Yet the explanation beneath these two simple words introduced a completely different perspective. Gratitude was not reserved only for pleasant experiences. It was also an acknowledgement that every difficult experience carried the possibility of revealing something that had remained hidden. Sarah set the book aside and reflected on the years she had spent believing that every financial setback was evidence that life was working against her. Now she wondered whether those repeated disappointments had been pointing toward the same unseen wound all along. If every obstacle had disappeared immediately, she might never have questioned the emotional patterns beneath them. The struggle itself had quietly become a teacher. That realization changed the meaning of gratitude entirely. She was not grateful because financial stress had been enjoyable. She was grateful because it had finally led her toward understanding herself more deeply than she ever thought possible. The next morning, she decided to conduct a small experiment. Throughout the day, she intentionally thanked moments that she normally would have ignored. She thanked the traffic light that gave her an extra minute to breathe before work. She thanked the delayed meeting that allowed her to organize her thoughts. She thanked the unexpected challenge at the office because it revealed skills she had forgotten she possessed. At first, the practice felt unusual, but by the afternoon, she noticed something remarkable. Her attention had quietly shifted away from searching for everything that was missing. Instead, it began recognizing what had always been present. Human attention naturally grows whatever it repeatedly notices. For years, Sarah had unintentionally trained her mind to scan constantly for lack, risk, and potential problems. Now she was gently teaching it to recognize support, opportunity, learning, and quiet moments of abundance that had previously passed unnoticed. She understood that this was not about pretending difficulties did not exist. Bills still had to be paid. Responsibilities still required attention. Challenges still appeared. Gratitude simply prevented those challenges from becoming the only story she believed about her life. Several days later, she met with the former client regarding the larger project. As the conversation unfolded, she noticed another difference within herself. Instead of trying to convince the client that she was capable, she focused entirely on understanding what they truly needed. The conversation became relaxed, honest, and surprisingly enjoyable. At the end of the meeting, the client smiled warmly and said they had chosen Sarah because they trusted her calm presence as much as her professional experience. Those words stayed with her during the drive home. Years earlier, she would have dismissed the compliment or assumed the client was simply being polite. This time, she allowed herself to receive it quietly without immediately arguing against it inside her own mind. That evening, she opened her notebook once more and wrote a sentence that seemed impossible only a few weeks earlier. Perhaps abundance begins with noticing what has already been given. She looked at those words for a long time. They did not suggest that gratitude alone would magically solve every financial challenge. Instead, they reminded her that a mind trained only to recognize scarcity will often overlook opportunities standing directly in front of it. Gratitude did not replace practical action. It transformed the emotional state from which practical action emerged. Sarah realized that every small shift inside her had begun influencing the way she spoke, listened, decided, and received. The outside world had not suddenly become easier. She had simply stopped meeting it through the same invisible fears that had quietly shaped so much of her past. And with every quiet expression of genuine gratitude, she sensed that another layer of those old emotional memories was gently beginning to dissolve. A few days after the meeting, Sarah received an email confirming that the project was officially hers. She read the message twice, not because she doubted its contents, but because she was quietly observing her own reaction. Years earlier, good news like this would have been followed almost immediately by anxiety. She would have wondered whether she was truly capable, whether she would disappoint someone, whether success would create expectations she could not sustain. This time those thoughts still appeared, but they no longer controlled the conversation inside her mind. She noticed them, smiled gently, and allowed them to pass without believing every word they whispered. That evening she returned to the blue book once again and found the fourth and final phrase. I love you. Of all the phrases, these 3 words felt the most difficult to speak sincerely. She had no trouble saying them to people she cared about. Saying them to herself felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. For years she had believed that self-love was something earned after proving enough, achieving enough, or fixing enough flaws. Yet the explanation before her described something completely different. Love was not a reward waiting at the end of personal improvement. It was the environment where genuine healing could finally happen. Sarah slowly closed the book and sat quietly in the fading afternoon light. She reflected on the frightened child who had tried so hard to protect her family by expecting less from life. That little girl had not needed criticism. She had needed reassurance. She had needed someone to tell her that she was never responsible for carrying burdens that belonged to adults. She had needed someone to remind her that her worth could never be measured by how little she asked for or how much she sacrificed. Sarah placed one hand over her heart and softly whispered, I love you. The words were not directed toward an image of perfection. They were offered to every version of herself she had spent years trying to change before accepting. The ambitious young woman who feared success. The exhausted employee who believed working harder would finally create peace. The anxious daughter who quietly carried invisible responsibilities. The hopeful child who simply wanted everyone she loved to be safe. For the first time, all of those versions seemed connected rather than divided. During the following weeks, Sarah noticed subtle changes that no financial statement could measure. She became more patient with herself when mistakes happened. She accepted compliments without immediately explaining why she did not deserve them. She stopped apologizing for taking up space in conversations. She began setting healthy boundaries without feeling guilty afterward. Most surprising of all, she discovered that genuine confidence did not feel loud or dramatic. It felt calm. It felt natural. It felt like no longer needing to argue with her own existence. As her inner world became quieter, opportunities continued appearing in unexpected ways. Existing clients referred new business. Conversations became easier because she no longer approached every interaction carrying invisible tension. She negotiated fair compensation with greater clarity because she no longer believed that asking for appropriate value automatically created conflict. These external changes were encouraging, but Sarah understood something important. They were not the true transformation. They were reflections of an inner shift that had already begun. Prosperity was no longer defined only by the balance in her bank account. It included waking each morning without the constant weight of fear. It included making decisions from clarity instead of survival. It included trusting that receiving something good did not require sacrificing her peace in return. One evening, she opened the notebook that had accompanied her through this entire journey. She slowly turned back to the very first page where she had written a single question. What did I learn about money before I was old enough to question it? Beneath that question, she added another sentence. What can I now choose to believe with the awareness I have today? She smiled as she read both lines together. The first question had led her into the past. The second quietly opened the future. She finally understood that emotional patterns inherited from childhood could influence a lifetime, but they did not have to determine a lifetime. Awareness created choice, and choice created freedom. As she closed the notebook, Sarah realized that the greatest gift she had received was not simply a new opportunity or a larger project. It was the ability to meet herself with compassion instead of fear. And from that place, she sensed that the life she had spent years trying to force into existence could finally begin unfolding with a sense of peace she had never believed was possible. Several months passed, and one quiet Friday evening Sarah found herself standing in exactly the same grocery store where she had once watched her mother carefully compare prices. The shelves were different now, the lighting brighter, and the store had been renovated more than once. Yet something about the place carried an unmistakable familiarity. She slowly walked through the aisles, placing what she needed into her cart, without calculating every single item against an invisible limit inside her mind. Halfway through the store, she suddenly stopped. It was not because of the prices or the products. It was because she realized something had quietly disappeared. The constant feeling of emotional urgency that had followed her for most of her adult life was no longer there. She smiled gently as the realization settled over her. Prosperity had entered her life long before her financial circumstances fully reflected it. It had arrived the moment fear stopped making every decision. On the drive home, she reflected on everything that had changed over the previous months. Her income had certainly improved. The new project had led to additional opportunities, and those opportunities had gradually expanded into relationships built on trust and mutual respect. She had become more comfortable discussing the value of her work without apologizing for it. She had begun setting aside savings with consistency instead of anxiety. Yet none of those changes represented the greatest transformation. The deepest shift was invisible. She no longer believed that receiving more meant taking something away from someone else. She no longer carried the hidden promise made by a frightened little girl who thought making herself smaller could somehow protect the people she loved. That promise had quietly dissolved through awareness, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, and love. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah remembered the question that had started everything. What if you have never actually been afraid of having too little money? She finally understood the answer. She had never truly feared money itself. She had feared what money represented inside her earliest emotional memories. She had feared becoming a burden. She had feared creating conflict. She had feared success because, somewhere deep within her unconscious mind, success had become connected with pressure, sacrifice, and the possibility of losing peace. Money had never been the enemy. Prosperity had never been rejecting her. The invisible barrier had been an emotional association quietly repeated for decades until it felt like reality. That realization transformed the entire story of her life. She saw that countless people spend years trying to change external circumstances while faithfully protecting the very internal patterns that recreate those circumstances. They change careers, but carry the same fear. They earn more income, but still believe they are not safe receiving it. They search for better opportunities while unconsciously remaining loyal to emotional promises they made as children. The pattern repeats, not because they lack intelligence or discipline, but because the nervous system continues choosing what feels emotionally familiar over what is actually possible. Sarah now understood why so many people remain trapped without realizing it. The prison rarely has visible walls. It is built from forgotten conclusions, inherited beliefs, and emotional memories that quietly become identity. Once identity says, "This is who I am," the mind begins gathering evidence to support that belief. Every setback becomes confirmation. Every success feels temporary. Every opportunity is filtered through the question, "Is this safe?" rather than, "Is this possible?" She sat quietly in her parked car for several minutes before going inside. The evening air was cool, and the neighborhood was wrapped in the peaceful stillness that arrives just after sunset. She closed her eyes and thought once more about the four simple phrases that had accompanied her through this journey. They had never functioned as magic words. They had served as gentle invitations. They invited her to acknowledge pain instead of hiding it. They invited her to release old emotional contracts instead of endlessly repeating them. They invited her to discover gratitude within every lesson and to offer love to every forgotten part of herself that had waited patiently for acceptance. As Sarah stepped out of the car and walked toward her front door, she realized that the greatest prosperity she had discovered could never be measured by numbers alone. It was the quiet freedom of no longer living according to fears she did not consciously choose. It was the peace that comes when the past is finally allowed to remain in the past. And in that moment, she understood that the life she had spent years trying to build had not begun with a larger paycheck or a better opportunity. It had begun the day she became willing to question a story that had never truly belonged to her. 1 year later, Sarah stood on the back porch of her home just before sunrise, holding a warm cup of coffee as the first lights spread quietly across the sky. Mornings had once been the time when anxiety arrived first, long before hope had a chance to speak. She used to wake already carrying tomorrow's worries before the day had even begun. Now she noticed something beautifully simple. Peace had become familiar, not because every problem had disappeared, and certainly not because life had become perfect, but because the invisible struggle inside her had finally begun to fade. Looking back, she realized that the greatest miracle had not been an unexpected financial breakthrough. It had been the slow disappearance of the belief that she was somehow separated from prosperity. That belief had quietly influenced every decision she made for years without ever introducing itself. Once it dissolved, life did not suddenly become effortless. Instead, it became honest. She no longer chased opportunities from desperation. She no longer rejected them from fear. She met each new possibility from a place of quiet presence. Her business continued to grow steadily. Some months were stronger than others. Some projects succeeded beyond expectation, while others taught valuable lessons. The difference was that she no longer interpreted every setback as proof that abundance was leaving her. She understood that seasons existed in every part of life. Just as nature moved through winter without believing spring had disappeared forever, she learned to trust that temporary challenges did not define permanent reality. One afternoon, she received a letter from a young woman who had attended one of her professional workshops. The letter explained that Sarah's calm confidence had inspired her to begin believing in herself again after years of doubting her abilities. Sarah smiled as she finished reading because she recognized something beautiful. She had never tried to teach confidence. She had simply stopped hiding from herself. Sometimes the most powerful gift we offer other people is the peace we quietly embody. She realized that prosperity had expanded far beyond money. It had become generosity without fear, rest without guilt, work without constant survival, receiving without apology, giving without resentment, trust without needing absolute certainty. These were forms of abundance that no economic downturn could completely take away. As the seasons continued changing, Sarah occasionally reopened the old notebook that had traveled beside her through every stage of her journey. The pages containing anxious questions remained exactly as they had always been. She never removed them because they reminded her where compassion had begun. New pages filled the notebook as well, not with perfect plans, but with reflections, moments of gratitude, quiet insights, and reminders that healing was never about reaching a final destination. It was about choosing awareness again each time an old fear attempted to return. Every now and then she still noticed familiar thoughts appearing. What if this does not last? What if everything falls apart again? The difference was that those thoughts no longer sounded like unquestionable truth. They sounded like echoes from a story that had already ended. She greeted them gently, allowed them to pass, and returned to the present moment. That, she realized, was true freedom. Freedom was not the absence of fear. It was no longer allowing fear to write the story of her future. Standing on the porch that peaceful morning, Sarah closed her eyes and silently repeated the 4 simple phrases that had become part of her daily life. They no longer felt like words she was trying to remember. They felt like a way of meeting life itself with openness. Each phrase reminded her that healing begins with awareness, grows through forgiveness, deepens with gratitude, and blossoms through love. She finally understood that prosperity had never been hiding somewhere outside her, waiting for perfect circumstances. It had always been waiting beneath the layers of fear, inherited beliefs, and forgotten emotional promises that had quietly covered it for so many years. The moment those layers began to soften, abundance found space to enter naturally. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath so many lives. We are not always separated from prosperity because it refuses to come to us. Sometimes we are separated from it because an old version of ourselves is still standing at the door, believing it must protect us from receiving what our hearts have been seeking all along. When that old guardian is finally thanked for carrying its burden for so many years, gently forgiven for the stories it believed, and lovingly invited to rest, the door does not have to be forced open. It simply opens by itself, allowing us to discover that what we were searching for had been waiting patiently within us from the very beginning.